What we're going to talk about tonight is the name Rosh Hashanah a mistake? Right? We're all familiar with the term Rosh Hashanah. Anybody who grew up in an at all traditional Jewish home is probably familiar with the term Rosh Hashanah. And people, if you were to ask a regular person, what is Rosh Hashanah? Most people are either going to reply, most people are going to say it's the Jewish New Year, or it's the beginning of the Jewish New Year. But that's not what the term Rosh Hashanah actually means, right? If you translate the words Rosh Hashanah, it means head of the year. Rosh means head, Hashanah means of the year. Rosh Hashanah means head of the year. Now, I've never heard someone wish someone else happy head of the year. People say Happy New Year. Happy head of the year sounds very cumbersome, a little bit strange. It almost seems like when they coined the name Rosh Hashanah, they called it the head of the year. It could almost seem like it was, a bad attempt at being poetic or something like that. Obviously, that's not the case. And when I ask, is the name Rosh Hashanah a mistake? That we know obviously the answer is no, but the question is why. So, I want to talk about, we're less than 2 weeks out from Rosh Hashanah now. Really get into what is Rosh Hashanah actually? The true nature of Rosh Hashanah, what's going on Rosh Hashanah, what happens on Rosh Hashanah. And once we understand what Rosh Hashanah actually is and what's happening, and how it's relevant to us, and how we can make the most of it, the name Rosh Hashanah is going to make a lot of sense. And I want to start off talking about the fact that how and why Rosh Hashanah is possibly the best. Investing in Rosh Hashanah is in doing Rosh Hashanah right. Investing in our personal Rosh Hashanah experience is probably the best investment we could ever make. Now, in life generally, there are a lot of things we can invest in, but obviously not all investments are equal. There are certain things. Let's talk about investing in quality of life. We can invest in specific details and aspects and parts of our life, and a lot of them can be good investments. And a lot of times when we invest, whether it's time, whether it's money, whether it's effort, or all of the above, into improving specific parts of our life, various areas of our lives, a lot of those investments can be good investments that will give a good ROI, a good return, and will make our lives measurably better. But there are some things that are generally going to be a disproportionately good investment. And some examples that come to mind are investing in health, investing in well-being. And some of the most simple and basic ones are going to always remain some of the best. Things like getting more sleep, eating more nutritious and healthy food, doing even just a little bit of exercise regularly. These are things that will transform every part of our lives. If we wake up in the morning feeling more energetic, and we have more energy during the day, and we're in a better headspace during the day, and we feel more motivated and positive during the day, that's going to impact every single part of our life, every single thing that we're involved in, personal, professional, you name it. If we are feeling more energetic and more motivated and more positive and more vibrant, every single part of life is going to be better. So things that are, and the reason that these are good investments is because they're universal. Something that improves our health affects every part of our lives, because our lives unfold, everything we experience, or our health, let's say, impacts our entire experience. When we're feeling less healthy, less energetic, that affects everything that we're exposed to, everything that we experience, everything that we do, everything that we're involved in. Because if we have less energy, then we're going to be less energetic for everything. If we have more energy, then we're going to have more energy in everything that we do and everything we experience and encounter and are involved in. If we're feeling more healthy, that's going to impact everything we do throughout the day. So things that are going to impact our health and overall well-being are generally going to be very good investments, because those are going to play out and unfold and provide a return in every single part of our life. We'll be able to work more efficiently and effectively, so we'll get more done while we're at work, and we'll probably do a better job while we're at work, and that may generate more income while we're at work, or get us a raise, or get us more business or more clients or whatever it is. When we're dealing with family or socially, if we're more energetic and feeling better, we're going to have better quality time with the people we care about. We're going to be able to socialize more happily and more positively. We're going to be able to interact with the people we care about more positively and more happily. And any time that we interact with the people close to us more happily and positively, it benefits everyone. We end up, that has a positive impact on the people we deal with. That in turn has a positive impact that comes back to us. So doing things that improve our health and well-being have an impact across every part of life, because all of our life occurs inside of and through our health. I want to give another example of a disproportionately good investment, or investment that's going to give a disproportionately high return on the investment. And there's an expression that people say, poor man pays twice. It's obviously not a blanket rule without exceptions, but through my own personal life experience, I've become a pretty big believer in the rule as something to take into consideration on a regular basis. And there are a couple of ways that it can play out. Poor man pays twice. Sometimes, we buy a cheaper version of something instead of a better version of something, and it's not unusual or uncommon that a cheaper version of whatever it is will be inferior quality, and it ends up either breaking or not doing the job properly, and then we have to buy the better version again anyways later on, and then we just pay twice and we spent more than we would have if we would have just bought the better one in the first place. Now again, that's not to say that we always have to buy the most expensive version of everything. Absolutely not. But it is important to consider whether we're saving now at the expense of ending up even more out of pocket later. So sometimes it'll apply in the case of buying something that we need to buy again later. Sometimes it can play out in terms of maybe getting cheaper labor to do a job. We want someone to fix or build something around the house or at work, and we hire someone who is less experienced and less of an expert because it costs a lot less, and then we end up having to fix and patch up the work they didn't, fix it again and again and again, and pretty quickly it becomes a lot more expensive than if we would have just gotten the more experienced person to do the job in the first place. Another way it might play out is if we, just a random example that comes to mind because it's going to work well as a mashal, as a metaphor, is, let's say for example we want to build some sort of a sculpture, and there are different kinds of metal. We hire a sculptor to make it, and there are different options for what kind of metal we can have them use and build the sculpture out of. Well, you don't build the sculpture, you pour it, but the sculptor will create a mold out of clay, and then we'll pour the metal into the mold to make the sculpture. And not all metals are equally costly, of course. So if we could opt for a cheaper metal to start with, but that cheaper metal might chip more easily, it might be softer, and over time it might lose its shape and lose its form, and if we want the sculpture to continue to look nice, we end up having to have someone come back and to patch it up and to fix it up and to fill in the chips and to re-bend it back into shape and to constantly be updating it and updating it and updating it, and maybe we might need to get more materials to fill in places where it got damaged and chipped, and again we end up spending a lot more money. Whereas had we started with and over time, we're going to have patches all over the place. We're going to have patches on the hands and the feet and the face and the right arm and the left arm and the fingers and the toes, and every part of the sculpture is going to end up over time needing to be fixed up and patched up, and there are these patches and fixes all over the place, each of which costs money, each of which ends up not looking as good as it really should, because a patch-up job rarely looks the same as something brand new. And over time we've spent all this extra money, all this extra time, all this extra effort for something that doesn't even look the same as it did when it started out. Now, had we started off with better metal, paid for a better quality metal, and the sculptor would have melted a better quality metal and poured that into the sculpture in the first place, the sculpture would have kept its shape. It wouldn't have lost its color. It wouldn't have chipped and broken. It wouldn't have bent out of shape because it was a better quality metal. Over time, number one is we may well end up saving money. Number two is we end up with a much more beautiful product than one that's been degraded and patched up and fixed up all over the place. And because we did it properly, and because the entire sculpture, the hands, the feet, the head, the hair, the toes, the fingers, the whole thing, the body, the legs, the arms, every part of the sculpture, when it's poured from the molten metal, it all comes from that same original block of metal. You start out with one block of metal. If we start out with a cheap block of metal, then each part of the sculpture is going to be cheap, and each part of the sculpture is going to end up having to be fixed and touched up, and each part of the sculpture is not going to end up looking as good as it should have or could have, and will probably end up out of pocket a lot more at the end of the day. Whereas if we would have started off with the block of raw metal, better quality metal, a stronger metal, a harder metal, a more beautiful metal to start with, and melted that and then poured that into the mold to make the sculpture, because the starting material, the metal we started with, was good quality, that's automatically going to result in better quality, stronger and more beautiful head and hair and body and arms and legs and hands and feet and fingers and toes. The whole thing's going to end up more beautiful because every part of the sculpture all came from that same original one block of metal. And if that one original block of metal was better quality, every part of the sculpture ends up better quality. And now we don't have to fix any of the sculpture because every part of it is made out of that same original better quality metal. And we end up with a beautiful sculpture that doesn't require the maintenance, doesn't require repairs, doesn't need to be fixed or patched up or recolored or anything else. Every part of that sculpture is now better because we invested in a better quality metal. And every part of that sculpture comes from that same original block of metal. And this is true, the same way this is true of every part of a sculpture, it's true of every moment in time. And I've mentioned this already previously, but I'm going to rehash it at least briefly because it's important. It's important, and it's a bit of a deep idea to really get clear and to wrap our heads around. And understanding this idea clearly and relating to it really makes or breaks, really is the foundation of understanding and getting this whole idea of what a special time is, what Rosh Hashanah is, what Yom Kippur is, what the month of Elul is, and why it really makes a difference. And this idea is that we think of time, time is something that exists absolutely. It doesn't change, it doesn't stop. It is what it is, and it keeps moving, right? You can't turn back time. Someone could figure out how to turn back time. They'd be the wealthiest person overnight, or before the night even started. Time just keeps moving, and it is what it is. We exist inside of time. The universe exists inside of time, and time it is what it is. It's there and it's absolute. And that is true to a degree. It's true relative to us because we exist inside of time. God created time as a framework, and then created the universe inside of time. Just like the universe is inside of space, it's inside of time and space. And going back to the analogy of the operating system, time and space are the operating system. The universe exists inside that operating system. It's the framework inside of which the universe exists. So something that affects time is going to be very powerful, have a very, very large impact Because everything that happens inside of time. If we can affect the time inside of which everything is happening, we can affect everything, the whole universe. Because the whole universe exists inside of that time. If we could, somehow, let's say, improve the nature of time, whatever that means, that'd be the best investment ever, because the whole universe exists inside of that time. And time is something that God created and continues to create. Doesn't feel like that to us, but it is. As far as God's concerned, as far as Hashem is concerned, time is a creation and space is a creation as much as a chair, as much as a person, as much as a rock or a molecule of water or a molecule of air. They're just creations. And God existed before there was time. When God existed, there wasn't even nothing. People, if you say there wasn't nothing in school, you get in big trouble because it's a double negative. You either say there was nothing or there wasn't anything. But in the beginning, before God created anything, there wasn't even nothing, because nothing's also a concept. There was just God and that's it. There wasn't anything and there wasn't nothing either. There were no concepts, no ideas, nothing. Not even nothing. So then God created time, and each moment in time is a creation. The same way that every point in space is a creation. Every atom, every molecule is a creation. Every object is a creation. Every idea is a creation. Every point in space is a creation, and every moment in time is a creation. And God is, let's say, creating time. Every moment is another creation. Every point in space is another creation. Every moment in time is its own independent creation. But here's where things get interesting. Time isn't actually created one moment at a time. Moments in time are not created individually. And I'm debating about using this as a metaphor because it kind of works, but it's not perfect. A person, every single one of us, originally existed as a single cell. One cell with all of our DNA in it. Everything that was necessary for us to become a full person was there. Everything that makes us who we are as an adult, everything that's in our bodies, in our personalities and characters, at least the innate part, the natural parts of that, it all was encoded for and already existed potentially in that one cell. It was just a matter of unpacking everything that existed in there potentially. So what happens? The cell replicates and becomes 2 and then 4 and then 8 and 16 and 32, and it grows and grows and grows. And then once there are a whole bunch of cells, the cells start to divide and separate, and then some of them become nerve cells and some of them become skin cells and blood cells and muscle cells, etc. until we have a complete person. But all of those different kinds of cells and everything that's there all existed potentially inside that one original cell. It was all there. And then the different parts of the body were, let's say, unpacked and extracted from the DNA, from the genetic code in that one cell, and each different detail was brought out and extracted, unpacked, until we had all the different details necessary. They were all there, but they were there all sort of included inside this one cell, which isn't a person yet, but it's everything that we need to have a person, and then over time it's extracted, unpacked, and then we end up with a full person. And time is created very much in the same way. And going back to the sculpture, this is kind of why I use that as a metaphor and analogy. Every part of the sculpture, the fingers, the toes, and that a really good sculpture, one of the things that differentiates an incredible sculpture that you just can't take your eyes off of from one that's really sort of basic and amateur, and there are a number of different things. One of the things is attention to detail. If you have a young kid in elementary school that's making their first some sort of form of a sculpture, I'll probably make a head and a body and a couple of hands and feet. You have a sculpture that's made by someone who really knows what they're doing. It's not just a body and a head and hands and feet. There are upper limbs and lower limbs and hands and 5 fingers, etc. And it goes way, way deeper than that. And I actually personally know an incredibly talented sculptor who makes sculptures that are unbelievable, literally jaw-dropping. You look at them and you get lost. And one of the things that makes them so incredible is the attention to detail. And he actually, before he started sculpturing, or early on in his career, he studied anatomy, because most of his sculptures are people, and he studied the anatomy of a person. Inside, he studied the shape of the skeleton of a person, and the difference between a male skeleton and a female skeleton, and the different muscles. He knows the names of just about every muscle in the body, and the structure, and where they are, and how they connect, and the tendons, and everything that from the inside out that makes us look the way we are. And he's aware of every single one of those details, and when he makes a sculpture, he's taking every single one of those things into account. He knows exactly the proportions and every detail and every little bulge and every crevice and every detail of the body, because he studied it all the way down, because he wanted his sculptures to be incredible, and they are. And the amount of detail, you look at his sculptures and they look almost like they were a person who got frozen into a statue. That's how good they are, because of the details. But every single one of those details, before he poured it, right? And the way it works is he creates sort of a sculpture out of a basic material. Then he makes a clay mold around the sculpture. Then he removes what the original shape was made out of and pours metal into the mold, and then takes off the mold, and he's left with a metal sculpture. The metal that gets poured into that mold is just a lump of metal. It's one lump of metal. You melt it, you pour it in, and after that metal gets poured into the mold, you end up with all of these incredible details, and head to toe, right to left, just the number of details, the amount of detail. And he could work full time for months, sometimes more than a year, just creating this shape because of the amount of detail, literally one hair at a time. Every single one of those details and the metal of each hair and each fingernail and each muscle fiber, all of it just came from that same one block. All of it existed in this one block. Once the block was melted and poured, it took on this shape with all these different details. It was all there just in this one block. And that's why investing in the quality of the sculpture while it was still in the form of a raw block would have been a good idea. It'd be a good idea to increase the quality of that metal in the beginning when it's one block of metal, get a better quality block of metal, depending on the difference in cost, of course. But if you can afford to get a better quality metal at the outset before you pour it, then when you melt that metal and pour it, it's going to impact every single part of the sculpture is going to be better off. And time is similar. Time isn't just created one moment at a time. God's not creating moments in time as we go, one moment, another moment, another moment, another moment. Time is created the same way that each part of a sculpture starts in one block of metal. Every moment in time is created. Time is created in 1 year batches. So Hashem creates a year's worth of time. Just like a sculpture starts with a person's worth of metal in raw form and then pours it to get the details. Similar, but not as much alike, to the way that every part of a person all exists inside this one cell, and then it develops and all the details are extracted and unpacked, and they all unfold from there. Every moment in a given year actually comes into being on Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, Hashem creates an entire year's worth of time. All the time of the coming year is created on Rosh Hashanah. And considering that time is the framework in which the universe exists, it's the operating system of the universe, if we can figure out a way to make that creation of a year's worth of time, the operating system of the universe for a whole year, if we can figure out how to make that better quality, that's going to be the best investment we could ever make. Because during Rosh Hashanah, Hashem's creating all the time for an entire year. 354-ish days, and it depends on the year, because an average non-leap year in the Jewish calendar is 354 days, which is 12 lunar months. And then we have every 2 to 3 years we have a leap year. Every several years we have a leap year, which has an extra month. So we the lunar calendar falls behind the solar calendar 11-ish days every year for a few years, and then we add a month, and then it jumps ahead of the solar calendar, and it falls back, jumps ahead. The reason we do that is because the Torah says that Pesach, just to compare lahavdil, there's a calendar event, let's call it a special month in the Islamic calendar called Ramadan. Right, and they observe it. It's a month. They observe the month of fasting every year, and that actually works out in different. That can be in any season of the year, because they also follow a lunar calendar. The lunar calendar, a lunar month, a cycle of the moon is 29 and a half days. So a lunar month, so a Jewish month. That's why Jewish months alternate between 29 days and 30 days. So, because you can't start, we don't start a month in the middle of a day, right? A new month is either, Rosh Chodesh is a day, the new month is a date. So it could either be 29 or 30. So it alternates between the months being 29 days and 30 days, and that way they end up averaging about 29 and a half. The problem is that the seasons, summer, autumn, winter, spring, are determined by the sun, not by the moon. And a solar calendar, a solar year, the sun year, has 365 days in it. And if you go by a lunar year, which is 354 days, it's 11 days less. What happens is that each year ends 11 days, the first year ends 11 days earlier than the solar year, which means the next year is going to be 22 days early. The next year is going to end 33 days earlier. And eventually after, 35 odd years, you're going to have lost a whole year, right? Because you've lost 11 days each year, and eventually you're going to have a whole extra year on the solar calendar. So every 3 years, the lunar calendar is going to be a whole month earlier, which means that every 9 years, the lunar calendar is going to be a whole season earlier. And the Torah says that Pesach has to be in spring, because Hashem took us out of Egypt in spring, and in order for us to appreciate what Hashem did and the fact that Hashem chose to take us out in spring when He could have taken us out in peak summer or the middle of winter, and He didn't, we always celebrate and commemorate that and make sure that Pesach should be in spring. Now, with a lunar calendar, if Pesach has a fixed date on a lunar calendar, it's not always going to be spring. Right? It's going to, every 9 years, it's going to be a full season early. It's going to be spring. Then after a few years, it's going to become winter, and then it's going to creep back all the way to fall, and then all the way back to summer, and then it'll be in spring again. And that's actually what Ramadan does. It just keeps getting earlier and earlier, and it goes all the way around through the seasons and keeps getting earlier and earlier and earlier, and does full cycles. It could be any time of the year. Because Pesach can't do that, because Pesach has to be in spring, so every few years we add a 13th month into the calendar, which pushes it late again, and then it creeps back, pushed forward, back, pushed forward. So the number of days in a Jewish calendar year generally is 354, but in a Jewish leap year, as opposed to a solar leap year, has a full extra month. We have 2 months of Adar Aleph and Adar base. There's 2 months of Adar in a Jewish leap year, so there's an extra whole month. So it could be as much as 384 days, but whatever it is, however many days of the year there are going to be, in a leap year, Hashem is creating 13 months worth of time during Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is that lump of time, just like that lump of metal that's going to become a full sculpture. Rosh Hashanah is like, it's almost like a lump of time. The Creator is bringing into being a full year's worth of time. But it's all sort of in a lump. In a leap year, on Rosh Hashanah of a leap year, Hashem's creating 13 months worth of time all at once. On a regular year, Hashem's creating 12 months worth of time all at once. And then every Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of every month, at the start of every month, a month's worth of time is it's almost like it's chiseled out or unpacked or extracted from that lump, that 1 year size lump of time. Every Rosh Chodesh, Hashem extracts a month's worth of time. And every week, Hashem extracts a week's worth of time from that month size lump of time. And every day, Hashem extracts a day's worth of time from that week's worth of time. And then every hour and every minute and every second and every moment. So however many, whatever the number of seconds is over the course of a year, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's big. And then within every second there are who knows how many moments of time. All of those are created on Rosh Hashanah in this general lump of time that will be unpacked and extracted over the course of the year. And this means that, before we get there, going back to the question that we started with, is the name Rosh Hashanah a mistake? The head of the year? It's not a mistake at all. And this is why. The function, what Rosh Hashanah, the role that Rosh Hashanah plays in the context of a year is exactly equivalent in many ways to the role that our head plays in the context of our body. And what's the most important thing in the head? Brain. Right? So the flagship feature or part of the head is the brain. And it's interesting, I mean, the amount of detail that we see discussed in Sfarim, in texts that were written hundreds of years ago, including some, even down to the embryology, is beyond incredible. There's a sefer that was written by the Mittler Rebbe, by the second Chabad Rebbe, called Ateres Rosh. And it's a pretty small sefer about the Yomim Noroim, about the high holidays. And on the first page, he talks about why it's called Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. And the reason that it's called the head of the year is because the role that Rosh Hashanah plays in the context of a year is identically equivalent in some ways to the role that a head plays in the context of a body. He talks about three specific things. All right, just imagine, for example, and for whatever reason, personally I'm skeptical that there will ever succeed at doing brain transplants. But I'm not claiming that it's impossible and it will never happen. I'm kind of skeptical. But let's just imagine, or try to visualize for a second, that we had the technology to actually transplant one person's brain into another person's body. It would be entirely different to any other sort of transplant. Right? When one person's heart is transplanted into another person's body, what happens is the person into whom the heart was placed, they received a heart. It's the same person with a new heart. Give them a new liver, it's the same person with a new liver, same person with new kidneys. So they got a heart transplant, a liver transplant, a kidney transplant. If we could take one person's brain, let's say that there was a situation, God forbid, there was a healthy person whose body was perfectly healthy but they were brain dead, and there was another person whose body was completely dysfunctional and unable to be repaired, but they had a very healthy brain. And we could take that healthy brain and transplant it into the healthy body. Hypothetically. It wouldn't really be a brain transplant. You wouldn't have the person, that body, the person who they were, and they just got a new brain. Right? Because our experiences exist in our brain, our personalities exist in our brain, our soul is primarily associated with our brain, our memories exist in our brain. So really, if we would transplant a brain, it wouldn't be a brain transplant, it would be more like a body transplant. When that person wakes up, they're going to have the memories of the person the brain came from, and the personality of the person the brain came from, and the characteristics and all of these things and the IQ, etc., of the person that the brain came from. They're going to wake up feeling like the person who the brain came from. They just have a new body. So a brain transplant wouldn't really be a brain transplant. If anything, it would be a body transplant, hypothetically. Does that make sense? So the brain is the place, that the part of the body that the soul is most directly connected to. It's almost like we could say the home of the soul. And the soul affects the whole body, but sort of the brain is the nexus, the focus. And because the soul and who we are is primarily associated with the brain is what keeps the whole body alive. And there's a phenomenon, if, God forbid, someone, let's say, loses, all contact between the central nervous system, the brain and the spine, and let's say, God forbid, a leg, they don't just lose the ability to use the leg. With time, the leg actually will start to, it's called to atrophy, to shrivel up, to get smaller and smaller and almost wither away, because the actual contact of a nerve that's connected to the brain and the spine and connected to the muscle keeps it active and alive. And as soon as that muscle loses contact through the nervous system with the brain and the spine, it loses that source of keeping it properly alive, and it actually will quite literally wither away over time. Because the brain, as the seat of the soul, is the source of life. The brain provides life for the body, and every part of the body has to stay in contact with the brain through nerves in order just to stay alive, let alone to be able to function properly, just to stay alive and healthy and fully alive. So the brain is a source of life for every part of the body. The brain controls every voluntary movement that happens in the body. And the truth is, not even every voluntary movement. Almost everything in the body, without exception, almost is controlled by the brain. Even things that are controlled, let's say there are a lot of things in the body that aren't directly controlled by nerves. A lot of things that happen in the bodies are controlled by chemical messengers, by hormones and things like that. All of those things ultimately track back to the brain, and there are different parts of the brain that control all the different hormonal pathways and things like that in the body as well. So almost everything that happens in the body is ultimately controlled by the brain. Now, so far we have two things. The brain is a source of life for the entire body. The brain controls everything that happens inside the body. And now, I want to take one specific area of that and focus on it a little more to illustrate the third point. One of the areas where it's easiest to visualize the brain controlling the body is voluntary movement, the movements that we choose to make, hands, feet, body, etc. And there's, on each side of the brain, there's a little area, probably about, I'm guessing roughly 1/4 to 1/2 cubic inch-ish on each side of the brain, called a primary motor cortex. A tiny little thing that probably it looks about that big, if you actually would look at it on a brain where it is. And that controls every voluntary movement throughout the entire body. Now, every single muscle in the body that we use for voluntary movement has its own specific neuron, its own specific cell in that part of the brain that controls it. There's one cell in the brain that is responsible for each finger, and not even each finger, the different muscles in different parts of the finger. Every single muscle, every movement that we make has its own nerve cell, its own neuron in that area of the brain that's dedicated to controlling it. And if you think about it, it would have to be that way. If one brain cell would activate 10 different muscles, then every time you wanted to move one of them, you'd have to move all 10, because that cell would activate and it would affect all of them. So the reason that we're able to control such our movements with such fine detail is because every little bit of movement, every specific muscle has its own nerve cell in the brain that represents it and controls it. And the same is true with information going in the opposite direction. Information that comes from our bodies into the brain. Let's say feeling, sensation, touch. Right? You can tell if someone's touching your index finger or your middle finger. Why? Because each finger has its own separate nerve cell neuron in the brain that senses that movement. When you touch over here, when you touch your middle finger, the tip of your middle finger, there's a nerve that takes that message up, and it's received in one specific neuron in the brain. You touch a different finger, it's carried by a different nerve to a different neuron in the brain. So the brain knows if this neuron's getting a message, it's coming from this place. If this neuron's getting a message, it's coming from that place. And that's how we know. You can close your eyes and tell where someone's touching you. And it's not just which finger, it's where on the finger. Because every single part of the body has its own specific part of the brain that's dedicated and represents it. Every part of the brain has every part of the body, every muscle, everything in the body, just about, almost without exception, everything that happens has its own specific part of the brain that's responsible for controlling it very specifically. And it's the same with incoming information. It's the same with speech. Everything that happens in the body has its own specific part of the brain that's very specifically dedicated to controlling it or to processing incoming information. So every part of the body has its own specific representation in super concentrated form inside the brain. And think about it, if just the thing that controls voluntary movement, the primary motor cortex is, let's say, about that big, and it's not that thick, let's say roughly a half a cubic inch in size. And every single part of the body that can move voluntarily, that we can choose to move, has its own specific representation just within the two primary motor cortices. We have one on each side. The right one controls the left movement and the left one controls the right movement. That means that in this, let's say, roughly half a cubic inch of brain, every single part of the body is represented. Think about how concentrated and how magnified that is. And this is why, for example, there's an expression, the thing that people talk about is like, oh, brain surgeon. It's people would say it's not rocket science or it's not brain surgery. Right? Because both of those things, every little detail has massive ramifications. If you're stitching up a cut in someone's hand, a 1/4 millimeter to the right or a 1/4 millimeter to the left, when you're putting the needle in to do the stitches, it's not going to make a massive difference. It's not the end of the world. Chances are, with a difference like that, you probably won't even be able to tell the difference in a scar when it heals up. A 1/4 millimeter of difference in a procedure in the brain means a completely different neuron, a completely different nerve cell, which is going to could affect a completely different part of the body because it's so concentrated. Because there's so much that's coming in from the body and going out to the body, all coming from within this little brain in our heads, that every single part of the body is represented in super concentrated form in the brain, which is why every little thing in the brain has a massive impact. God forbid, a damage to a tiny little bit of the brain could have a massive impact to the body, because everything in the body is represented in super concentrated form in the brain and controlled in super concentrated form in the brain. So we have three things here that we've talked about the brain, which is in the head. It's a source of life for the entire body. It controls everything that happens in the entire body. And every part of the body is represented in super concentrated form inside the brain. And each of these things is true of Rosh Hashanah relative to the year. Every part of the body gets its life from the brain. Every moment in time throughout the entire year gets its life from Rosh Hashanah, because that's when Hashem creates an entire year's worth of time. If all the time of the coming year, 12 or 13 months worth of time, is all created in Rosh Hashanah, that means it still has to be extracted and unpacked throughout the course of the year, but it's all created on Rosh Hashanah. The life of the entire operating system, a year's worth of time, all comes into being and is brought to life, brought into being on Rosh Hashanah. The life, so to speak, of the entire year's worth of time all comes from Rosh Hashanah. And we know we talk about Rosh Hashanah as a day of judgment. It says that on Rosh Hashanah Hashem sits with, the book of life, and Hashem decides everything that's happening throughout the coming year. And another way of looking at that is that because Hashem's creating all the time of the coming year on Rosh Hashanah, so the nature of all of that time is determined in the moment in which Hashem creates it. All of the time of the coming year is created already on Rosh Hashanah. So on Rosh Hashanah, the nature of all of that time is determined. So the things that are naturally, destined to occur throughout the year are all actually predestined on Rosh Hashanah when that time is created. So everything that's going to happen throughout the year, the nature of all of a year's worth of time, is all controlled by Rosh Hashanah. The same way that the head controls everything that happens throughout the body, Rosh Hashanah controls the nature and occurrences of throughout an entire year's worth of time. So Rosh Hashanah is the source of life for the entire year, just like the brain is a source of life for the entire body. Rosh Hashanah controls everything that's going to happen throughout the year, the same way that the brain controls everything that happens throughout the body. And just like every part of the body is represented in super concentrated form within the brain, every moment over the course of the coming year is represented in super concentrated form within the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because that's when Hashem creates this lump of time from which every moment of time in the coming year is going to be extracted. So every moment of time that's going to happen throughout the course of the year actually exists within Rosh Hashanah, the same way that every part of that sculpture already exists in that block of metal. It's just that we don't see the shape yet. We don't get to see the shape until the metal is melted and poured and then cools off and we remove the mold, and then you see the details. But every part of that sculpture was there in that lump of metal. Every moment in time of an entire year already existed in super concentrated form in that lump of time that was created on Rosh Hashanah. That Rosh Hashanah, those 25 hours of Rosh Hashanah, already contain within them an entire year's worth of time. And this is why it's called the head of the year. It's not just called the beginning of the year or a new year. It's not a mistake. It's intentional and deliberate and precise. Because Rosh Hashanah is equivalent. The role that Rosh Hashanah plays for a year is equivalent to the role that a head plays for the body. So Rosh Hashanah is quite literally, functionally speaking, Rosh Hashanah actually is the head of the year. It's the source of life for the year. The whole year exists inside of it in concentrated form, and it controls everything that happens throughout the year, just like the brain, the head, does all of those three things for the entire body. And this is why Rosh Hashanah is the best investment a person could ever make. Investing in doing Rosh Hashanah right, in being intentional over Rosh Hashanah, trying to be serious and to do it the best we can, to focus. And for everyone it's different. The halachas, the customs are the same. The halachas are the same, the laws are the same, the schedule is approximately the same, generally speaking. But the personal experience is unique. The things that we think about while we're praying, the personal connection that we form with Hashem, with the Creator, while we're praying, while we're doing all the things that we're doing, whatever it is, while we're preparing the meal, which is also a mitzvah. Every part of Rosh Hashanah, everything we do throughout the course of Rosh Hashanah, has an impact on an entire year's worth of time. So first of all, we're talking about impacting time, which is the operating system of existence, which already makes it a good investment. Not only that, but it's an entire year's worth of time. And this is why traditionally we've seen, it's been relatively common throughout our history that people take Rosh Hashanah very seriously. Some people, many people still today focus on just spending every available second on Rosh Hashanah saying Tehillim. A lot of people try to avoid idle chatter, certainly try to avoid saying anything negative. Because every moment in Rosh Hashanah, if we think about it, we're talking about 25 hours, 2 days, being extracted and unpacked into about, let's say on average, 360-ish days. So we're talking about a ratio of about 180 to 1. So every minute of Rosh Hashanah, and it's not like necessarily that it's that direct, but just in terms of the impact, you're talking about approximately 180 to 1. So every moment of time on Rosh Hashanah that we spend trying to do things right and having a good Rosh Hashanah, intentionally having making it the best experience that we're able to make it, that unfolds into, let's say, roughly speaking, 180 times that amount of time throughout the year. It has 180 times the impact on the quality of the time of the operating system of our experience and of the universe for the entire coming year. That makes it a very good investment. The same way that, God forbid, damage to a very small part of the brain could have a massive impact on the body. Being able to repair a very small part of the brain would have an incredible impact on the body. Being able to improve, and that's why, it's probably one of the, or whatever, I don't know about that, but one thing that I see very, very frequently, I see ads for supplements to improve, to wake up, make our brains more functional and improve our memory and our thought and our clarity. And generally I'm pretty skeptical, but if there was a product like that actually delivered that, it would be a really good idea, right? Because if our brains work better, every part of our life is going to be better, because our brains control and run everything. A small improvement in the brain would have a massive impact on every area of our life, a disproportionately large impact on our life, and every little improvement on Rosh Hashanah has a massive impact on the coming year. The same way that some of the best investments we can make in ourselves are the investments we can make in our head. And in terms of supplements, I'm pretty skeptical, but there are a lot of things that we can do to change the way that we see things, change our perspective, change our framing and the way we see things and the way we think about things and positivity and things like that. Every little bit of improvement we make in these sorts of things has a massive impact on our life, because our brain controls everything that happens in our life. And every little improvement that we make in Rosh Hashanah has a massive impact on the coming year, because an entire year's worth of time is created on Rosh Hashanah. Every moment in the coming year is already brought into being on Rosh Hashanah. It's that year's worth, that lump of time, a year's worth of time is created in a lump on Rosh Hashanah, and it's extracted and unpacked. And doing Rosh Hashanah right means that we can have a positive impact on the creation of an entire year's worth of time, all at once. It's true that if the sculpture is not doing very well, it's not good, we can patch it up and we can fix it up and we can make improvements one at a time. But if you could just improve the quality of that lump of metal before it's poured, that's going to affect the whole thing. Same thing, it's true that as the year unfolds, it's not like after Rosh Hashanah it's too late. As the year unfolds, we can make improvements at every moment in time and we can do things to make changes. But making changes on Rosh Hashanah automatically has an effect on the entire year, because the entire year's worth of time already comes into being on Rosh Hashanah. So the little things we do on Rosh Hashanah have an impact on an entire year's worth of time. And this is why it's called Rosh Hashanah, because it is quite literally, functionally speaking, it is actually literally the head of the year that controls everything that happens in the coming year, the entire year. Every moment's represented within it in super concentrated form. And if there was ever something that was worth really putting in effort to do right, and to enjoy and to be happy and to do it with joy and to do it correctly and to do it the best way that we're able to do it, which is all that we can ever do and all we're ever supposed to do and expected to do, and it's all that Hashem ever wants of us, is to do the best we can. If there was ever anything that would be a good idea to do the best we can, it's going to be Rosh Hashanah, because the things we do on Rosh Hashanah have an impact on the entire year. L'chaim. Sivach Sima Tova.